Hi friends, welcome back to the Modern Wisdom Podcast. My guest today is David Pearce. We're going to be talking all things transhumanism. That is not talking about people changing their genders, but it is exploring some very exciting topic areas which I've wanted to sink my teeth into for a while. So today, expect to learn why suffering of any kind is an artifact that might have been useful to our ancestors, but is something that we need to transcend as soon as possible. How David thinks that humanity not only should, but also must progress towards a more hedonic imperative. The hard problem of consciousness and why we might not be uploading our brains into computers anytime soon. And a lot of interesting discussions about the implications of CRISPR and gene editing on the whole. We cover a lot of topics that I definitely should have been much more well educated on, seeing as they have massive implications and are also pretty current to society right now. But yeah, I loved the conversation. David is a massively prominent figure in the transhumanism movement, and I feel very privileged to have had him on teaching us the 101 of transhumanism. So without further ado, please welcome David Pearce. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I am joined by David Pearce today. David, welcome to the show.
Hi, Chris. It's good to be with you.
Fantastic to have you on today. Also nice to hear a familiar accent. So we're talking about transhumanism today. This will be a new venture for a lot of the listeners. So let's start off with a definition. Can you tell us what transhumanism is?
Well, there are no sacred texts, but very simplistically, I sometimes talk about the three supers of transhumanism. Superintelligence. This is the idea that it's going to be possible to radically amplify our intelligence and machine intelligence, and there are different ways one can go about this. There are different conceptions of posthuman superintelligence, but that's one of the three supers. Then there is super longevity. This is the idea that there is no immutable law of nature that says that biological robots must grow old and die, whereas silicon robots can be repaired indefinitely. And transhumanists believe in radical life extension, indefinite youth, with the backup of cryonics or maybe even cryoeuthanasia, because for any of your listeners who perhaps of a certain age think that realistically they're not going to make it. And the third super, which is the super I focus on most of all, super happiness or super well-being. This is the idea that it's going to be possible to replace the biology of pain and misery and suffering with life based entirely on gradients of intelligent well-being. This is replacing the biology of suffering not just in humans, but in the long run, the rest of the animal kingdom throughout the living world. Now, as well as those three supers, there are plenty of transhumanists who would want to add a fourth super, though they don't agree what that might be. For example, what about super empathy? But I would argue that this is embraced by any sufficiently rich conception of superintelligence, that a full spectrum superintelligence wouldn't just have an off-the-scale IQ, it would also have a superhuman capacity for perspective taking, empathetic understanding. So there, in a nutshell.
Fantastic. It's no small task, I think, is one way to kind of summarize the transhumanist movement then. Interestingly, I had Professor David Sinclair on recently, who you may know.
Right, yes, indeed, yes.
Yes, I had him on not long ago talking about the cutting-edge longevity research that he's doing, and during that I asked him, do you think that a human could live for 1,000 years? And his short answer was yes. So it's interesting to hear that people from multiple fields, very different fields, from coming at it from genetics and gene editing, coming at it from this longevity research, and then your side as well, are all pointing in a similar direction.
Yes, I mean, this is it. I think a lot of people psychologically would switch off if one were to say, well, look, our grandchildren won't grow old and die, but you will. I mean, there's something almost cruel about telling people that science is going to find a cure for aging shortly after you're dead. And I don't know this. Unlike most transhumanists, I'm not, shall we say, one of life's temperamental optimists. But nonetheless, as I said, as well as supporting research into anti-aging technologies, there is one strand of the super longevity aspect of transhumanism that is focused on cryonics and even cryothanasia. So,
what are those two terms for us, please?
Essentially, sorry, I should have said this is the idea that if you are suspended in optimal conditions, that so long as irreversible information loss doesn't occur, it'll be possible to reanimate you at some future date when there is a cure for whatever killed you. Now, it is extremely difficult in a technical sense to destroy information. Some physicists would say impossible, but nonetheless, I would say a big imponderable is whether that people who are frozen a long time, by about long time I mean hours after their nominal death, whether it will be possible to reanimate them. That in practice deterioration may be too far advanced, but in principle, at any rate, one could have something like cryothanasia rather than waiting until you're 95 and gaga. Have yourself suspended where you are still, shall we say, in the prime of life. It hasn't been done yet, but this is this would be one possible option.
That sounds an awful lot like a book that I've just about finished. Have you read Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky?
I blush to say it is now many, many years since I've read a novel. That is
cool. So it was the winner of the 2016 Arthur C. Clarke Award, and it was the 30th anniversary one as well. So they gave it out to a fantastic book, and in that they have people who dip in and out of suspended animation, these long sleeps for going across big, vast galactic distances between different star systems and stuff like that. And they jump in and out of it like you'd get a shower. But it sounds like the technology for that's a little bit further away. So moving on to your particular domain of competence, you were talking about super happiness.
Yes, once again, that's just a slogan. But yes, if you think of perhaps today's hedonic range as -10 to 0 to +10, with -10 being the absolute pit of despair, unbearable agony, hedonic 0 being emotionally neutral experience, and +10 being the most wonderful peak experience of your life. Mm-hmm. Imagine if it were possible to engineer a civilization that, let's say, stretched from +70 to +100. Now, if that sounds too much like science fiction, well, that may well be the case. And much more morally urgent, I think, is focusing on the sub-zero states that plague so many lives today. That sadly natural selection didn't optimize us for being happy, it optimized us for leaving more copies of our genes, or as evolutionary biologists like to say, to maximize our inclusive genetic fitness. And yeah, there's no real convincing scientific evidence that on average we are happier or sadder or more or less contented or discontented today than we were on the African savannah, which is very counterintuitive. But yeah, the hedonic treadmill is designed to keep us discontented a lot of the time, essentially because it's good for our genes. And if we are ethically serious about getting rid of pain and suffering, we're going to have to tackle its genetic biological roots. I mean, that may sound like crude genetic determinism. In practice, one is going to need a twin track approach, everything from basic income to decent accommodation, healthcare, and so forth. All the kind of environmental stopgaps, yes. But if we're ever to get rid of the horrors of depression, anxiety disorders, essentially all the nasty aspects of Darwinian life, we're going to have to edit our genetic source code. And perhaps the first thing I think we should do is, prospective parents at the moment. Does one have a genetic crapshoot? And recall, every child born today is a unique, untested genetic experiment. Or does one try to load the genetic dice in favor of one's offspring by giving them a high hedonic setpoint, high pain threshold, and traits like that? Now, I think there are real ethical questions about whether one really wants to bring more pain and suffering into the world, but given most people do want to have kids, I think the best one can do is urge them to first of all consider pre-implantation genetic screening, and soon CRISPR genome editing.
Yeah, I was listening to Jamie Metzel on Joe Rogan just earlier on today. Do you know Jamie? Have you heard of his work?
Yes.
So I was listening to those two go at it, and a lot of these topics came up. I think CRISPR at the moment is kind of a hot topic for the ethical questions that it's offering. But Jamie offered a really interesting point, which was, he said in the future, he thinks that parents who potentially have typically biological births are maybe going to be seen as irresponsible in the same way as parents who don't vaccinate their children now. That if you had the choice of choosing through IVF or whatever advanced version of that is, this, what was it, embryonic selection perhaps?
Pre-implantation genetic screening. This isn't the same as actual genome editing, which a lot of people regard as more radical. It's simply choosing what Mother Nature has thrown up. But ultimately, it's a false distinction. And yes, I think it's a good parallel. That yes, in most of history, yes, one just had to trust Mother Nature, God, fate, providence, or whatnot. But increasingly, it's going to be a matter. Responsible parents are going to be choosing the genetic makeup, the traits of their future offspring, and the very nature of selection pressure is going to change too. I mean, natural selection, sexual selection, it's blind and based on random genetic variations, whereas increasingly as the reproductive revolution unfolds, I think there's going to be selection pressure in favor of life based on gradients of well-being, but that's obviously speculative.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm sure a lot of people who are listening will be thinking the same as me, which is there's a very odd visceral reaction that I have about this selective birth. It creates these feelings of unease, and I can't work out why. And I'm fairly forward thinking with regards to this. I find technological progress exciting, probably above everything else, exciting ahead of scary, probably. So, and even for me, there's something about that. And yet you can draw parallels that had you have told people 1,000 years ago that you'd be able to fly across oceans, or had you have told people 5,000 years ago that you'd be able to get an injection that would stop them from dying from all of the things that are constantly killing them and their family, or you could take a pill and it would stop you from feeling sick. All of these things at that point would have been felt or would have been considered unnatural. Is this just another frontier, or is there actually something different about the movement that we're going towards here?
Well, this time it's different, but then it always is. And any of your listeners who are thinking of all of the possible things that can go wrong, I think it's a healthy suspicion that there needs to be exhaustive risk reward analysis. The thinking of all the conceivable things that can go wrong. I mean, inevitably, a lot of people, this kind of reflex eugenics, the Third Reich, race hygiene. Other people will say Brave New World.
Yeah.
Another reason is that when we try to imagine the future, there is a lot of neurological evidence that what we're doing is drawing upon memory, and the memory which we're drawing on is essentially sci-fi, often sci-fi read when we were kids. And sure, half-digested memories of everything from, kind of Gattaca, or in the case of superintelligence, Skynet. So, yeah, I mean, as I said, I very much sympathize with anyone who is suspicious and who is pessimistic. Nonetheless, if we are to get rid of the horrific burden of suffering in the world, we're going to have to tackle it at its genetic source. Essentially, our genes designed us to be unhappy and discontented a lot of the time. And unless we actually do edit our genetic source code, there is going to be obscene misery and suffering in the world indefinitely.
Are you sometimes surprised that we manage to have lives of the degree of happiness that we do, given our genetic predisposition?
Yes, at times. I mean, this is it. Nature seems to just sort of play around with the dials, and that those, sadly, there are a very significant minority of people who endure kind of chronic misery, pain, depression. Equally, there are life's temperamental optimists and even extreme genetic outliers who spend most of their lives, extremely happy. Which is kind of existence proof. Essentially, being temperamentally very happy, it's a kind of high risk, high reward. One is more likely to go out, do things, explore the world, take risks, and so on, if one is a happy, extroverted go-getter. Whereas if you have low mood, you're more likely to keep your head down. It's a kind of low risk, low reward. I mean, that's a very crude dichotomy.
Yeah.
Most people, on balance, love life. I mean, I might, given my rather gloomy and depressive temperament, think of Darwinian life as sort of sentient malware, but this is very much the minority position. And yeah, one needn't be a Buddhist or a negative utilitarian to believe that we should aim to prevent and minimize unnecessary suffering. And what seems quite counterintuitive is the idea that all suffering, all experience below hedonic zero is going to become technically optional. Sure, suffering in one's life, sometimes, but only sometimes it can be instructive and valuable. But the critical question to ask is it functionally indispensable? And as silicon robots, machine intelligence, AI progressively eclipses humans in ever more cognitive domains without the nasty raw feels of pain and suffering, I think we just have to face up to the fact that, that suffering is just a ghastly implementation detail of Darwinian life, and we ought to be switching to a more civilized signaling system instead.
Yeah, it's this odd artifact that's come along for the ride, hasn't it? So I want to talk about the Hedonistic Imperative and the Abolitionist Project, both of which you're big proponents of. Would you be able to explain to the listeners what those are, please?
Yes, I mean, the Hedonistic Imperative was the name of an online manifesto I wrote back in 1995. Why the Hedonistic Imperative? Well, I would really have liked to call it, the moral imperative to use biotechnology to phase out suffering throughout the living world. But of course, no, one needs something snappy and catchy. So
I think your marketing's better on this one, David. I think the Hedonistic Imperative works better. Yeah.
I mean, it's not ideal because hedonism connotes something vaguely shallow and amoral.
You think Woodstock, don't you?
Whereas I do see there is a desperate moral urgency to getting rid of suffering. But in a nutshell, it gives it gives the gist. The abolitionist project really just alludes to getting rid of suffering in both human and non-human animals via biotechnology. How far one goes beyond this, though personally I'm a negative utilitarian, I think that overriding obligation is to get rid of suffering, and then everything else, it's a bonus, icing on the cake. Nonetheless, yes, I do foresee a civilization where their darkest lows are richer than today's peak experiences. But that probably strikes most people as science fiction. And that if anyone with a more down-to-earth temperament, I would, yes, stress more the issue of suffering, yeah.
I understand. So getting towards the rubber meeting the road, so to speak, how are we beginning to go about that? What's the beginning of the proposed strategy, the next steps from now, and then where does that lead us to in the longer term, like the real far future?
Well, a lot of futurology consists of extrapolation, which is dangerous. And sadly, though we are just the first CRISPR babies, if you think of the scandal of this Chinese researcher who did it allegedly without authorization.
From the parents,
Well, he may have got, I was thinking more of the state. We now know that not merely did the researcher aim to make the kids protected against HIV, that purely inadvertently, it seems memory and intelligence may have been enhanced. Genes involved in cognitive augmentation. I'm personally rather skeptical that this was a mere oversight.
Accident,
but so I mean, that said, yes, we are starting to pinpoint specific genes and allelic combinations involved in low mood, pain sensitivity. And even today, if we are ethically serious, it is possible to choose via pre-implantation genetic screening or CRISPR genome editing, ensuring that your kid has, let's say, start at an extremely high pain threshold. Why not abolish pain altogether? Well, maybe one day it's going to be possible to do so with smart prostheses or literally gradients of bliss. But just for now, leaving the sci-fi aside, if you give your kid, let's say, a benign version of the SCN9A gene, SCN9A is a pain modulating gene that has dozens of different alleles, different variations, nonsense mutations, no capacity to experience pain at all, but other mutations, high or low pain sensitivity. And by doing this, essentially, you can ensure that, if you've ever met the kind of person, today's outliers, the kind of person who says that pain is just a useful signaling mechanism. Before we get rid of pain altogether, it would be possible to kind of ratchet up pain thresholds. Would need to be done with care. For example, do people with extremely high pain thresholds not show perhaps sufficient empathy for the plight of others? That's the kind of thing to consider. But nonetheless, other things being equal, one wants to give kids a high pain threshold. The other trait I think one would wish to focus on is hedonic setpoint. Hedonic setpoint, this is this approximate level of well-being or ill-being that most people tend to fluctuate around in the course of a lifetime. And some people have a really high hedonic setpoint, other people low hedonic setpoint. And though one can't point to a single gene that that is decisive here. Nonetheless, there are a handful of genes associated with or rather, particular alleles associated with having a high hedonic set point, and do we want to ensure that our children do have this high hedonic set point, or today's genetic crapshoot? And I think the genetic crapshoot is unethical. Of course, as well as our kids, understandably, most of us want to feel better ourselves. And yes, of course, designer drugs, mood brighteners, nootropics, there are a number of possible interventions there. But at the risk of sounding very boring and conservative, given the degree of our ignorance still, believe it or not, if anyone emails me sort of what pills do you recommend, yeah, probably far better to initially at least focus on this trinity of good sleep discipline, optimal aerobic exercise, and diet, good nutrition. That sounds rather boring, but so few people really get these optimal. But obviously there are pharmacological interventions too.
Yeah, a couple of points there. Firstly, the last thing that you touched on about people seeming to think that there needs to be a very fancy solution to a very complicated problem. We often talk about the use of people to jump on the back of nootropics or caffeine abuse in an effort to become more productive when they're unable to do deep work or stay focused on one task for 10 minutes. Or they don't understand how to task manage. They don't understand how to capture or process or review their to-do list, for instance. And it's the equivalent of taking steroids having never been to the gym for us, that you're going a lot faster in the wrong direction.
Yes, and all too many of today's drugs, rather than cheating the hedonic treadmill, actually kick it into gear with a vengeance. So yes, I'm actually, though I write about and discuss different mood brighteners, drugs have well-known pitfalls. I mean, one of the biggest pitfalls, unfortunately, is that the neurotransmitter system most directly involved in hedonic tone, whether one feels good or bad, is the opioid system, the mu-opioid receptor. And opioids obviously have very well-known pitfalls. So it would be much better if we were designed genetically to have high hedonic set points rather than needing to repair nature's deficiencies.
Yes, I understand. Moving to the point that you made about pain, one of the first things that comes to mind is, surely do we not need pain? I need to know if I put my hand in some hot water, I need to know if a car's run over my foot, etc., etc. If people are just walking around in this numb state of not knowing what's going on, are there not some downstream negatives?
Oh, indeed. I mean, this is, people born with congenital insensitivity to pain need to lead a cotton wool existence. I mean, in the wild, they would just have died, and they're more likely to take risks. However, there are other people who just simply have an extremely high pain threshold. There was the case of Jo Cameron, this Scottish lady, responsible, retired school teacher, vegan, came to the interest of medical professionals because she waved away painkillers and the like because she just didn't feel she needed them after what ought to be an extremely painful medical procedure. She described childbirth as a mere tickle. Rather than someone with complete insensitivity, it seems as though she just naturally has an extremely high pain threshold, and genetically genetic and research suggested that she had mutations in two genes in particular, the far and what's been christened the far out gene, which are responsible for anandamide, the breakdown of anandamide. Anandamide is literally, etymologically, bliss molecule, and she has naturally high levels of anandamide, and she appears to have gone through life in a state of mild euphoria, but not. But as I said, responsible pillar of the local community, vegan, school teacher. One obviously needs to be extremely wary of placing too much faith in individual case studies. But I mean, another example I give is of my transhumanist colleague Anders Sandberg, who will acknowledge, I do have a ridiculously high hedonic set point. This is back to your original question. What is critical to intelligent behavior, to responding adaptively to noxious stimuli, isn't one's absolute place on the plane or pleasure scale. It's some kind of hedonic gradient. One might imagine that people who are just exceptionally happy would be less motivated to behave adaptively. But counterintuitively, this doesn't seem to be the case. That other things being equal, the more you love life, the more you're motivated to protect and preserve it. Whereas it's depressives who get stuck in a rut, they experience learned helplessness, behavioral despair, sometimes self-destructive behavior. But preserving information sensitivity, the distinction between being blissful and blissed out.
I think that's something that was in the back of my mind, that if it's a world where essentially everyone's walking around on MDMA, like 100x MDMA sensations, but a little bit more sober and able to remember what's going on, I wonder how useful that society would be. I think there's some parallels that can probably be drawn between that as a genetic or pharmacological solution and some of the concerns people have with universal basic income, that when you take away what is considered to be people's current reason for living, that they'll be left in this kind of wallowy state where everyone's just lying around eating Skittles on beanbags and stuff like that.
Yes. It's. I mean, in the case of universal basic income, I think it's just a matter of any decent society will have something like universal basic income and get rid of this appalling, sprawling welfare bureaucracy. But nonetheless, I mean, the basic, can be relatively basic. That I don't. I won't go off on a long spiel there. It's very easy to to sound off, setting the world to rights. But on the whole, I don't tackle the social issues to the same degree. I mean, I do have views on everything from Donald Trump to climate change to you name it. But the point is, other people have said it better. So
yeah, I understand. I think you've got some fairly niched down stuff that you need to be working on as well. I think you can leave the politics to some other people. So one of the things that I'm thinking about straight off the bat, having read Superintelligence by Nick Bostrom, listeners of the show will know that I found the book both testing and very, very fascinating. Rather than being selective with our genes or using particular drugs or whatever it might be to edit the way that we exist in the real world, why not just do whole brain emulation or upload ourselves to the internet?
Ooh, difficult question, because this brings us to the nature of consciousness and the binding problem.
Let's jump into it, David. Come on, let's go feet first into the binding problem, my friend. We're in at the deep end now.
Okay. The hard problem and the binding problem are worth distinguishing, though they're interrelated. The hard problem is, why does consciousness exist at all? Why aren't we pea zombies? Nothing in the laws of physics is understood today if one assumes that our basic understanding of the world, quantum field theory, describes fields of insentience rather than sentience. If one makes that very modest assumption, nothing in today's physics and chemistry forbids you and I from talking to each other now, and we are both being pea zombies. So that's the question.
What's a pea zombie?
Oh, sorry, a philosophical zombie
who
acts in exactly the same way as you or me, but isn't conscious, isn't sentient. And I think the interesting question isn't the skeptical question, how do I know that you're not a pea zombie? The interesting question is, why aren't we pea zombies? How is it possible for consciousness to have the causal capacity to allow us to pose questions about its existence, for instance? So, yeah, that's in a nutshell the hard problem. The binding problem, which probably fewer people are familiar with, is that even if you think that consciousness is absolutely fundamental to the world, why aren't we so-called micro-experiential zombies? I mean, the population, as an example, here is, the population of United States, let's say, what's the population of the United States?
I'm not too sure. Give me 1 second and I will tell you.
It's
population. It is 327.2 million.
320, yeah. Now, simply the fact that one has 327 million skull-bound minds, however they intercommunicate, nonetheless, with no reason to think that the population of the United States is a mind, a unitary bound mind. Or one can't be sure that the population of the USA isn't a unitary subjective experience, but that kind of strong emergence would be some kind of spooky. It's difficult to reconcile with monistic physicalism. But the question is, why are our brains any different? After all, you and me, we are 86 billion membrane-bound nerve cells. Even if you think that individual nerve cells maybe kind of support rudimentary consciousness, rudimentary experience, why aren't we just micro-experiential zombies, just patterns of mind dust? And so, that is the binding problem. And here I'm very much out on a limb. I don't think phenomenal binding is a classical phenomenon, quantum mind. There are powerful arguments against this, but less controversially, today's classical digital computers are not subjects of experience, and simply increasing speed of execution, their complexity, or even making them massively parallel, there's no reason to think that sentience is somehow going to switch on.
So it's not a case of, I think Sam Harris talks about it being that with processing power, consciousness comes along for the ride.
I suppose a lot of researchers, a lot of AI researchers do assume that at some time in future our machines will become conscious. But personally, I think the idea that consciousness arises at some kind of computational level of abstraction is a mistake, and that I don't think classical digital computers are ever going to be more than zombies. So therefore, I don't think you or I are ever going to be uploading ourselves, into digital computers. But I stress this is obviously a controversial topic.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned Nick's book on superintelligence. Very, very crudely, there are amongst transhumanists there are three quite different conceptions of of superintelligence.
Fascinating. Tell us about them.
Okay, there is one conception of superintelligence, and this is one I personally subscribe to, that essentially posthuman superintelligence will be us, that recursively self-improving biological robots are going to edit their own source code and bootstrap our way to full spectrum superintelligence, critically with the aid of narrow AI, that essentially all the kind of clever machine, all the stuff one reads about, essentially we're going to be incorporating it within ourselves, neurochips, smart prostheses, and just as I could beat Kasparov today with a neurochip. Okay, that's cheating, but nonetheless,
still won.
I still likewise there is so this kind of intimate neuroface, but I mean I don't think digital computers ever going to become conscious per se. Okay, that's one conception of superintelligence. Superintelligence as ultimately our biological descendants, transhumans and posthumans. Then there is another conception of superintelligence associated with Ray Kurzweil that essentially sees us as completely merging with our machines, possibly involving, to mind uploading, that any distinction between humans and our machines will become completely meaningless. That's the second conception. But there is a third conception of posthuman superintelligence. Originally, it came up with by I.J. Good, mathematician in the 1960s, developed by Eliezer Yudkowsky and his colleagues at MIRI, and put in its most magisterial form by Nick in his book Superintelligence, which is essentially sees a combination, and I stress the combination of Moore's law, i.e. exponential increase in computer processing power, together with recursively self-improving software-based AI. That is software that improves itself in this escalating cycle. And on this conception of posthuman superintelligence, there's no particular reason to expect that AI, artificial general intelligence, will be sentience friendly, human friendly. Its values may be perhaps completely orthogonal. So I'm glossing over all manner of complications here, but if someone does start talking about superintelligence, it's worth probing what they mean. I mean, I for instance think that full spectrum superintelligence will involve such things as exploring radically altered state spaces of consciousness, and it's unclear what it would mean for a digital zombie to start exploring altered state spaces. Yeah,
I understand. That's it's interesting to hear different stances or different viewpoints on the future superintelligence movement, so to speak. Certainly Naval, who is a big hero of mine when it comes to the podcasting space, he talks about the fact that recently there hasn't really been an awful lot of movement towards artificial general intelligence. I think people look at stuff like AlphaGo, Zero, and these sort of programs which are simulacrums of human intelligence, but in an incredibly narrow domain. And the domain is getting increasingly complex, but not actually wider. And he talks about the fact that any progress in general artificial intelligence kind of hasn't really been very many developments. And that kind of lends credence towards what you were saying, which is that you will have the head of the mothership still being reliant on the biological system that we are. And then you're augmenting with the narrow AI within its capabilities to add on the functions that we need.
Yes, I mean, there's always a risk essentially when one is talking about superintelligence, in practice one ends up just obliquely expressing one's own limitations. I can't step outside myself and really obviously tell you what will be the nature of full spectrum superintelligence. I would just urge, shall we say, a degree of caution before assuming that AI is somehow going to wake up.
I understand. So one of the questions that Joe Rogan asked Jamie Metzl the other day was why we have this insatiable desire to try and improve ourselves. Do you think that that's the way that we're wired? And if that's the case, isn't that quite a poetically beautiful way for us to transcend our own genetics?
Yes, so this is back to, kind of natural selection designed us to be discontented a lot of the time. I wouldn't say all of us, or at least even most of us, necessarily spend our time trying to improve ourselves, but certainly not many people think, well, I've had enough, I've got enough money, or I've had enough reproductive opportunities and so on. Other things being equal, wanting more is fitness enhancing. So yes.
I understand completely. So moving on, one question that I really wanted to ask was, if you had the opportunity to create a wish list of advisors to help the government understand the future and where they should be directing research and funds, would you be able to put together a little dream team of advisors for them? And would you be able to tell us why you'd choose those people?
I probably could, but just not off my head like that. I would it would also be invidious too, and so. Yes, obviously, I would love to be able to do so. I mean, as yet, no, shall we say, billionaire or corporate colossus has approached me with funding, but yes, it's
it's in the post, David. I promise you, it's in the post, mate. I think it will be. So, in terms of risks, are there things that are at the forefront of your thinking that you're concerned about as we move forward with this? Are there risks to the way that the project can go, the way that the public perceives it, or more kind of nitty-gritty concerns to do with the actual way in which we proceed towards the hedonistic imperative?
Yeah, by risks. And there are some people, including some transhumanists, who think of life as fundamentally good and we don't want to put it all at risk. Whereas my conception of life today, frankly, is much bleaker. That's the non-human animals in factory farms and slaughterhouses are as sentient as pre-linguistic toddlers.
Is that correct?
If one is being more careful, one has to say that a pig, for example, is demonstrably more sapient than a pre-linguistic toddler. One can't be certain that the pig is as sentient.
Yes.
Nonetheless, the actual particular structures, neurological structures, genes, neurotransmitters that mediate our most powerful experiences of panic, of pain, distress, are nearly identical. So short of radical skepticism or solipsism, yes, I am as confident that a pig is as sentient as I am that you're sentient. And so, yes, given what I think posterity will recognize as a crime against sentience of almost unimaginable proportions, I think perhaps our most urgent priority right now is just to get factory farms and slaughterhouses shut and outlawed. Now, moral argument clearly plays a role, but I'm quite cynical about human nature. I think we're going to need to hasten the development and commercialization of in vitro meat substitutes. It's not a distinctively transhumanist technology, in vitro meat. In vitro meat could be genetically engineered. It's much more likely to be widely accepted if it's not. But yeah, essentially, I would see, we have this absolute moral obligation to get factory farms, slaughterhouses shut. That I think heaven knows how we'll explain what we did to our grandchildren. So yeah, I mean, although I can happily talk to you about all the wonderful transhumanist technologies and ideas for the future, I think part of creating a world based on gradients of intelligent bliss involves stopping systematically harming sentient beings. We can't be serious about trying to build a happy biosphere if we're systematically harming others to gratify our own appetites.
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective to be able to try and take yourself away from your current experience and almost imagine the remembered self looking from the future. That degree of perspective, I think, is something that not a lot of people are used to doing, and it's obvious that when you do look at it in black and white, you are correct that you're breeding animals to suffer purely for your own enjoyment to eat. It's a difficult justification to make.
Yeah, I mean, personally, it's completely ethically indefensible. I mean, I should add that, by an accident of birth, I've never even tasted meat. So it's not. I mean, as I said, it's not as though I'm trying to parade my moral superiority. But if one hasn't got this source of bias, yes, seeing what we are doing, one reads some horrific case of child abuse in the papers and sort of viscerally is feeling, God, this terrible abuse ought to be locked up to life. But then you see across the table someone tucking into a bacon sandwich. But yeah, if I pass the meat counter in a supermarket, I think of Auschwitz and I think of child abuse. And I mean, this is it. When people are actually shown one of these videos about what goes on in factory farms and slaughterhouses, some people seem genuinely sort of shocked. But far worse things go on off camera. I mean, it really is unspeakable. Yeah.
Fantastic. So, David, before we wrap up, I wanted to ask for a suggestion of a book or a resource or a blog which you would recommend if people think this was an interesting discussion, and I'd quite like to find out some more about transhumanism and the transhumanist movement.
Ooh, heavens! Well, I have
put on the spot again, David. You're gonna have to put your money where your mouth is. I'm not letting you sidle out of this one. I like the government advisors thing that you got.
In spite of my low testosterone, I'm going to say back in 1995, when the web was young, in fact it was 1996, I set up a motherlode website, hedweb.com, hedweb.com, and though a lot of the material there is dated, certainly the style, nonetheless, everything from core answers about transhumanism to the core of the manifesto, together with links to other transhumanist resources, and if what I've been talking to you about does strike a chord, there are plenty of hot links there. But Chris, very much appreciated. It's been great chatting.
It's been fantastic. Hedweb.com will be linked in the show notes below, as well as some of the resources which we've been going through today. David, I really found today fascinating. Hopefully within the next few years, we might be coming back on to discuss some exciting new developments in the world of transhumanism. But for now, we'll catch you later on. Thank you so much for your time.
Fantastic, Chris.
Yeah.